Alright kids, playtime is over. You've had your fun, a whole 6 weeks of casual-ish play. But ProQuest season is here once again, and it's back to the grind. Headed into this season, all eyes will be on Iyslander, but with over 2 months of tech time and the new tools from Dynasty, it'll be very interesting to see how the smart players can adjust to handle the new meta.
A huge shout out to our channel members for supporting what we do here. If you want to get involved with the channel and the Dice Commando community, please consider joining as a channel member. Remember, these videos are only possible with your support. You can show that support with a like, a subscribe, and by leaving us a comment and sharing your feedback. Community first, and go Commando.
My goodness, I do not know if I'm ready for all of this, but either way, ProQuest season is here, kicking off the long march towards Worlds next fall. So, deep breath, and here we go. So yeah, welcome back to Dice Commando and Go again. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going over the state of things going into ProQuest Season 3. Now, what today's cast is not is a tier list. The fact is there's every reason to expect a very, very, very diverse meta out of the gate. Furthermore, given that ProQuest season is only 3 weeks long this time, I question how well people will be able to pivot and respond in the middle of the season. As such, I think it's reasonable to expect a wide meta across not just the first week, but probably the entire time. As such, trying to sit here and claim what's the best, what's going to win 40% of the events, and so on, is probably just kind of ludicrous. So instead, I'm going to run down the heroes that I expect to see by and large at your ProQuests and some of the advantages and matchups. Now, there have been a handful of competitive events like Battle Hardens and so on during the break, but by and large, this is the first entry back into widespread competitive play since Worlds in early November. And as I see it, there are two major factors in play that will drive changes going into this meta. First and most obvious is, of course, Dynasty's release. Having been released the week after Worlds, this will be the first time that we see what the player base can do with all their new toys. Certainly some of the tools that a few of the heroes, like Dash, got in Dynasty will certainly have impacts, and will change the relative strengths of those heroes. The second factor, though, is one that I think is being underplayed right now, and that's what we can only really fairly call the Michael Hamilton effect. When he won Worlds with his innovative Iyslander build, there were some significant ripple effects across the world of Flesh and Blood. The most obvious is, of course, that people will net deck and iterate on his build, and as such we can certainly expect to see a fair number of Iyslander players over the next few weeks. But the other side of that, and what I'm really interested to see how it develops, is what one can really only call Big Red Fab. To a certain degree, there has been a baseline philosophy change in how many players approach value and opportunity in Flesh and Blood. We've seen the Big Red attacks finding their way into many other builds as well, even in a few unexpected places like maybe Dorinthea. And while it remains uncertain how Big Red Fab will ultimately play out across the competitive tables, if at all, it's something that I think is pretty important to watch over the next 3 weeks. While I obviously agree that many eyes are on Iyslander going into the season, the two heroes I want to talk about first today are actually Dash and Fi. In a very diverse field like we expect to see, aggro is often a very solid place to land as it can just kind of do its thing. In cases where you don't always know exactly what to tech for, sometimes just coming in, going aggressive, pooping cards on the table is a pretty solid move. Fi in particular is likely to do very well. He has some very explosive turns, and being able to tech either Link's Mask or Mask of Momentum based on the matchup is also a very strong tool for him. There are a couple slightly different builds out there, but in general can play pretty well into Jermai and Iyslander, and has decent matchup into a very wide field. I do expect Fi to be pretty heavily represented at our ProQuests for a couple of reasons. As already mentioned, he's strong, but also running more of a straightforward deck is not a horrible strategy going into these full, long tournaments. Many of them are going to be 6-7 rounds. It's a lot less taxing, and the faster playstyle ensures more breaks between rounds. Now sure, while I grouped Dash with Fi here as aggro, that's a true but not true type scenario. Dash's flexibility continues to be her best asset without question, but Dash Boost is a very, very good aggro deck, and I've been pretty impressed with some of the Hyperdriver Crankshaft builds that I've been seeing around the edge of the meta, which can potentially go pitchless with Nabi Blaster. That said, as we know, with only a handful of cards she can pivot from full boosty boost to pistol items. She has enough blues to hold her own versus Iyslander, and can overwhelm in-game against Cranky Grandpa as well. Dash has consistently for many, many metas now been a top 8 type hero, always the bridesmaid, rarely the bride. But I think this meta might be her time to shine on the back of Dynasty's shiny new toys. Next up is, yes, the frosty elephant in the room, Iyslander. And as I outright said earlier, she is very likely to be around quite a bit during ProQuest. There's very little doubt that she's a tier 1 hero. I do suspect, though, that she presents as a binary hero in the field based on the player, either at the very top or not. If they're running the Hamilton style build, which I don't know why you wouldn't, honestly, the deck can be a little tricky. That said, her ability to threaten 2 turns to your 1, often every other turn, is absurdly strong. She also has an advantage in that she makes you change your game plan. You can't just non-attack, attack, swing. Sorry, Runeblades. Many decks are swerving slightly to figure out how to just swing and present damage out of the gate, such as the Big Red strategy, as a counter to her. Icelander's impact, both direct and indirect, is going to be felt across this season for sure. Briar in her CMH Channel Mount Heroic build is a very strong aggro deck that can just pop off. Her CMH turn explosivity is off the charts, and in many cases, as long as she can pull it off, for many heroes, there's often really no recovering from it. The question I have on Briar is really how much of her we're going to see versus how well those players do. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if Briar ends up being relatively lowly represented with a pretty decent conversion rate, much of that driven by Briar mains who've been repping her for a long, long time. Briar personally scares the S out of me, and I can't wait for her to LL. But will she this season? Probably not, but more on that later this week. And if you're watching this later, I will link the video up there. Next up is Sassy Lexi, and I do expect to see a good amount of Lexi, likely primarily in her ice form at our ProQuest. Lexi and her ice disruption is a pretty strong call into an aggro-heavy matchup. She also has the ability to pump and throw damage, which also isn't a horrible spot given some of the other decks. Lexi's a great matchup into, as mentioned, a lot of the aggro heroes, and disruption hurts Runeblade specifically. That said, the Ranger problem of not blocking well puts her into this somewhat weird spot where she's only defending by disrupting, and Lexi definitely can have brick turns where she doesn't draw the right things. Cards like Frostfang can certainly help on this a bit, but doesn't overall solve the issue. Interestingly enough, Cranky Grandpa doesn't seem to be getting a lot of love with some of the other content creators of late, but he is a staple. A grindy, boring staple, but his presence, in my opinion, really affects a lot of the meta. There are some heroes who just cannot take down Cranky Grandpa. His Sealed, Shield, React, Ice Hammer over and over and over is just too much from a fatigue standpoint. There's not a ton more to say here. He'll be there, the loyalists will be on him, and he'll make top 8s. If my other thoughts are correct, then he probably ends up being just top 8s, probably. But in the right field, Oldhim can certainly perform. Rhinar will be an interesting one to watch going into this season. Part of me thinks that he'll do really well, and the other part wonders if his success at the end of last year was more of a surprise factor than anything. Rhinar did pick up some pretty decent tools in Dynasty, so it'll be interesting to see how those small changes to the package can impact it overall. But they do seem very strong. Rhinar can just sometimes win games, and from many aspects plays well into some of the top meta heroes, until of course he doesn't, which I think might be the overall challenge he faces. I do think that ultimately the chaos factor of Brute can present cumulative challenges over the course of a long day. So we'll ultimately see where he lands, but regardless, he's someone that you need to be very aware of how to play against and handle, if you even can, during your ProQuests. Jeremiah may not be a top-tier hero in all respects, but she's going to be very consistently present in ProQuest season because A, the Illusionist cult loves their Dragon Mommy, and B, she's a pretty decent matchup into a couple of the aforementioned heroes. Icelander specifically she's strong into. Also, she's pretty decent into Oldhim, as long as you stack your rakes. Conversely, though, she's a pretty bad matchup into a couple of other heroes, such as Fi. And if he's out there, well, so either way, as mentioned, she's going to be there, so know how to handle her. These last three I want to talk about together, but kind of as an outlier group. This is Viserai, Dorinthea, and Bravo. So Viserai, I still think, is just insanely strong with just the value he can from pooping out rune chants. The game is not up yet, but we'll go up later this week, of my Dorinthea in the final versus Billy at our last Gongai, and I just got freaking steamrolled. Viserai can output damage like a champ, and if he gets rolling, it is really tough to stop him. So I really think Viserai is an underrated, potentially underrated contender within this, but I don't know that you're going to see that many of them, but I think if you sit down versus a Viserai player, you should probably be pretty worried. Next is, as I mentioned on my own, Dorinthea. There's some pretty neat builds out there with her. She's very much evolving to not always on that second swing, but kind of like get a counter or two on and then be able to go over the top. I've seen several different builds out there. There's kind of the one I'm playing. There's Josh Lau's version, and probably should go with him. But either way, she can always just kind of show up and wreck somebody's day. She's very strong into Fi, which is a good meta call in the field because we expect to see a lot of Fi. So definitely make sure you know what you're doing versus Dorinthea. And then last, but certainly not least, is Bravo. Bravo stacks a lot of blues, packs a lot of blues. and has Anathos, which are very, very strong. He can Spinal Crush, Crippling Crush. He can do what he needs, and he's actually, I mean, he's pretty good in Defy as well. He has enough blues that he can kind of hold out versus Iyslander. The dash matchup is a little tough, but again, Bravo is always just a good staple in the meta. Now, I also want to acknowledge someone's probably going to be mad at me because Azalea wasn't really mentioned on here, so Azalea, but no, seriously, come on, folks, right? She's really great into aggro. She actually is with Red in the Ledger, but she's really bad against a lot of other heroes. So I personally am just not seeing it. I know that there will be some Azaleas out there at the ProQuest because people are loyal. More power to them. I hope you guys get a couple wins. I just don't think she's going to be at the top tables, and I don't think that's too hot of a take. But hey, shoot some arrows, baby. So there you have it, folks. Obviously, I cast a pretty wide net here with the heroes we talked about, but I think it's fair because, you know, even a Brainstorm Kano could still show up and ruin a tryhard's day if the draw goes right. So as I said, I'm not really personally mentally ready for an 11 months of Smash Face Flesh and Blood yet. But hey, it's here. Here we go, baby. So I will see you guys at the tables. Good luck at your ProQuests, and go Commando.